The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Marcus Hayes parked his car in the lot outside the city courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The early morning light cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Marcus took a deep breath. He despised being late. As a senior prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice, he prided himself on being punctual, prepared, and disciplined. But today was different. A phone call about a federal case had delayed him. Something about a motion from the defense in a high-profile drug case. The timing couldn't have been worse, but Marcus had done what he could to handle the situation before rushing to court. He straightened his tie and adjusted his jacket, a dark charcoal suit over a crisp white shirt, and headed toward the courthouse, knowing he was cutting it close. The case he was about to present was minor in comparison to the weight of the work he typically handled, but it was personal. The city had wrongfully increased the property tax on his grandmother's home. The house had been in the family for generations, and the taxes had always been consistent, until now. The hike was inexplicable, and Marcus had spent weeks gathering evidence to challenge the adjustment. He could feel the weight of the case, but what weighed heavier was his grandmother's memory. The house was more than property to him. It was the cornerstone of his childhood, a place where he had learned everything he knew about right and wrong under his grandmother's careful guidance. As he entered the courtroom, Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the message. It was from his assistant at the Justice Department. The judge, Judge Gregory Mitchell, was known for being strict about tardiness. "Be careful," the message said. Marcus tucked the phone into his briefcase and shook his head, knowing he couldn't afford to dwell on it. The municipal courtroom was far less impressive than the federal courtrooms where Marcus usually worked. The walls were a dull beige, the furniture worn. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and old documents. Despite the lack of polish, there was an undercurrent of anxiety in the room. People sitting on edge, awaiting their turn for what were mostly small disputes, parking tickets, and petty claims. Marcus glanced at his watch, 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes before his case was called. He quickly moved through the crowded hall and found the courtroom, room 203. A sign on the door read, "Judge Gregory Mitchell," in brass letters. Inside, people were already filing in, and Marcus found a seat near the back. He opened his folder, scanning his evidence. As he reviewed his notes, he saw Judge Mitchell enter. The judge was tall, with a salt and pepper beard and intense brown eyes. He moved with an air of authority, his very presence commanding attention. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone in the room stood. Marcus straightened, his posture as stiff as his suit. Judge Mitchell took his seat and began calling cases one by one. His tone was efficient and crisp, but it lacked warmth. A man walked in 5 minutes late, and then a woman in casual clothes came in and sat down. Neither of them received any acknowledgement from the judge. Marcus made a note of it, but focused on his own case. He was prepared, even though his day had started off on the wrong foot. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., his name was called. He gathered his folder and walked to the podium. As he did, Judge Mitchell's sharp gaze met his, and Marcus could feel the tension in the air. The judge didn't waste time. "You're late, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Marcus raised his hand slightly, palms out in an acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was handling urgent matters for a federal case." "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," Judge Mitchell interrupted. "This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, perhaps you need to reevaluate your priorities." The weight of those words hung in the air. Marcus remained calm. His professional career had been built on handling difficult situations with poise. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness, and if I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Mitchell waved his hand dismissively. "We'll get to that, Mr. Hayes, but first, there's the matter of your tardiness. It undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You're hereby fined $750. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The fine wasn't just about money.
It was about something deeper, something that felt off. He glanced around the room. The man who had arrived late earlier didn't receive a fine. The woman in casual clothes who had walked in after him was not reprimanded. It was clear to Marcus that there was a pattern here, a pattern he couldn't ignore. As the judge continued with the next case, Marcus opened his folder again. But this time, he didn't focus on the property tax documents. He began writing notes furiously, his pen moving across the page. The judge's disregard for fairness was more than just frustrating. It was personal. Marcus knew he wasn't just dealing with a simple property tax dispute. This was about something much larger. As the courtroom proceeded, Marcus sat quietly in the back row, processing everything he had observed. His mind raced, analyzing every moment, every slight. He could sense the tension around him, the palpable discomfort among the other attendees. Judge Mitchell's handling of the proceedings was not just inefficient, it felt intentionally dismissive when it came to certain individuals. He replayed the moment in his mind, the fine, the casual disregard for the late arrivals who had been spared judgment. It wasn't just tardiness, it was about respect, or the lack of it. The session carried on with the same mechanical efficiency. Judge Mitchell called case after case, moving with impersonal rigor, as though the weight of each matter was merely an item to check off a list. The disparity in treatment of the latecomers continued to gnaw at Marcus. He could see it in the eyes of the people sitting in the room. Some were aware, some oblivious, but all were affected by the court's unspoken biases.
Finally, at 9:40 a.m., his name echoed through the room again. He rose, adjusted his tie, and walked to the podium with a calm stride, his composure unshaken despite the undercurrent of tension. This was his moment, not just to challenge the property tax error, but to stand for something larger. As he placed the folder on the podium, he could feel the eyes of the room on him. The silence felt deafening as he began to speak. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady, "I have here documentation regarding an erroneous property tax adjustment on the home my grandmother left to me. This property has been in my family for over 70 years. For the past 5 years, the tax assessments have remained consistent, but suddenly this year they have raised the rate by 30% without notice or explanation." He flipped through the folder, placing the tax assessments and photographs on the podium. He pointed to a particular page. "This document shows the original tax assessments. The new adjustment reflects a steep and unsubstantiated increase, and I've brought proof that the city's adjustment is erroneous. I request the court's attention to this matter." Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the documents with a clear sense of disinterest. "I'll review it in due time, Mr. Hayes," he said dismissively. "However, your tardiness this morning is still a matter we cannot overlook." Marcus remained composed, though the words stung. "Your Honor, I respect the court's rules, but I was late due to a federal matter regarding an ongoing human trafficking investigation. This is a serious case, one that required my immediate attention." Judge Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not relent. "Your federal responsibilities are noted, Mr. Hayes. However, they do not excuse you from adhering to this court's procedures. Rules exist for a reason. Your priorities, while admirable, do not take precedence over the order of this court." Marcus took a slow breath, then looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I understand that, but I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone here?" His words were measured but firm, carrying the weight of something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. The room went still. The judge's expression hardened, his features sharpening as if daring Marcus to continue. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice now edged with something colder than before. "I'm asking for clarity, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his tone calm but resolute. "It's important that fairness be applied across the board, not just to me, but to everyone in this courtroom." A ripple of unease passed through the room. A few people glanced around, their faces betraying their discomfort. The tension was thick, but no one spoke.
Judge Mitchell raised his gavel, silencing the room with a sharp motion. "I will not tolerate accusations of bias or discrimination in this court," Judge Mitchell's voice thundered. "I'm not accusing, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice still even. "I'm simply asking for clarity. We must ensure that every individual in this court is treated with the same respect, regardless of who they are."
The judge's expression grew darker, but Marcus didn't back down. He knew he had to keep going, that this was bigger than his case. It was about fairness, about equal treatment, about the system working for everyone, not just for the powerful or the privileged. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his tone unwavering, "I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone in this room. This court must be held accountable for its actions. We must make sure that bias, whether conscious or unconscious, doesn't influence the way justice is served." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sharp click of the judge's gavel. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Mitchell said with an unsettling calm, "you are free to go. The fine remains." Marcus nodded, though his jaw clenched slightly. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room upon him, some supportive, others skeptical. But the moment wasn't over. This was only the beginning. As the court session adjourned, Marcus lingered for a moment, gathering his things. He could sense the change in the atmosphere. Something had shifted in that courtroom, and he knew it. People were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. He left the courtroom, his mind already turning over the next steps. He would not let this go. This was more than a simple tax dispute or a personal slight. It was a systemic issue that demanded attention. He would make sure of it. Outside, the sun was high in the sky, and the courthouse steps seemed to stretch out in front of him, a symbol of the long road ahead. As he stood there, thinking through his next move, he checked his phone. A message from his assistant at the Justice Department. "Are you okay?" the message read. "You handled yourself well today. Just be careful. This might get bigger than we expected." Marcus exhaled slowly, staring at his phone for a moment before typing his response. "I'm fine, and it's already bigger. This is just the beginning." As he slid the phone back into his pocket, a quiet resolve settled within him. He wasn't just fighting for his grandmother's house or for his own dignity. He was fighting for the fairness that everyone in that courtroom and beyond deserved. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and strategic planning. Marcus knew that what had transpired in the courtroom that morning wasn't just a personal battle. It was a challenge to the system, a system that had long been built on subtle inequalities and unconscious bias. He couldn't let it go. As much as he respected the law, he knew the law had its flaws that needed to be addressed, no matter the cost. By the time Marcus arrived at the office the following morning, the atmosphere had already shifted. His assistant, Grace, was waiting for him with a stack of papers and a look of concern on her face. "You okay?" she asked, her tone a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Marcus nodded. "I'm fine, but I need your help with something."
Grace set the papers aside and turned her full attention to him. "What's going on?" "I'm going to pursue this. I can't just let it go. What I saw in that courtroom wasn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern, and I intend to dig into it." Marcus's eyes were focused, determined. "But I can't do it alone." Grace hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't think you're alone in this. The legal community will back you up. People have seen this before, but no one's had the courage to speak up." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He had always known that bias in the court system existed, but to see it so blatant, right in front of him, left him unsettled. He'd watched it unfold, witnessed the disparity with his own eyes, and he couldn't turn away from it. "I need to gather evidence," Marcus said after a pause. "I'm not just talking about my case. I want to see if there's a pattern across Judge Mitchell's courtroom and others. If there's systemic bias, we need to expose it. I'm going to need records, court cases, fines, decisions, anything that will show a consistent trend. Grace nodded. I'll get started, but this won't be easy. You'll need more than just paperwork. People will be hesitant to talk, especially when it involves a judge. Marcus smiled grimly. I know, but we can't back down. Not now. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. With Grace's help, they pulled public records, spoke with former defendants, and reached out to colleagues in the legal community. What they found was both disturbing and predictable. Judge Mitchell wasn't the only one. There were others in the municipal court system who seemed to apply the law in ways that disproportionately impacted Black and minority defendants. The fines were heavier, the sentences longer, and the courtroom procedures far less forgiving for certain individuals. One of the most telling examples came from a retired bailiff, Richard Foster, who had worked in Mitchell's courtroom for years. He had always been aware of the subtle biases, but had never felt empowered to speak out. Now, as Marcus interviewed him, Foster hesitated before speaking. "I've seen it, Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "I've seen how he treats people differently depending on their race. I've seen Black defendants get hit with fines they couldn't afford, while white defendants barely got a slap on the wrist. I've seen him interrupt Black defendants, cut them off mid-sentence, but let white defendants explain their case without interruption." Marcus took careful notes, his mind racing. This wasn't just about the fine. It was about something much bigger, about how power and authority were used to perpetuate inequality. A week later, the pressure began to mount. Marcus's investigation had picked up steam, and word had started to spread. What had started as a simple property tax dispute had now turned into something larger. News outlets were starting to pick up on the allegations of bias, and social media was abuzz with the stories of individuals who had experienced similar treatment in courtrooms across the country.
A hashtag began to trend, #EqualJusticeNow. It quickly gained traction as people shared their own experiences of racial disparities in the judicial system. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but so was the backlash. There were those who accused Marcus of stirring up trouble, of overreacting to something that wasn't really an issue. But he was undeterred. He knew that exposing systemic bias wasn't about stirring trouble, it was about creating change. Meanwhile, the Judicial Review Commission had taken notice. They contacted Marcus to set up a formal inquiry. As the investigation progressed, the committee discovered the same patterns Marcus had observed in Judge Mitchell's courtroom. Black defendants were fined more frequently and more severely than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Furthermore, Black defendants were more likely to be interrupted and dismissed, while white defendants received leniency and understanding. The day the Judicial Review Commission made its findings public, Marcus stood before a small crowd of reporters, his heart pounding in his chest. It had taken weeks of hard work, but they had the evidence they needed. The data didn't lie. Judge Mitchell's actions were part of a larger systemic issue, Marcus said to the gathered reporters, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The findings are clear. Racial disparities exist in our court system, and it's time we address them head-on. This isn't just about one judge. This is about fairness. This is about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race, has equal access to justice. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks as Marcus spoke. The story was everywhere. Social media lit up with posts from activists, legal experts, and ordinary citizens, all demanding accountability. The pressure on Judge Mitchell was immense, and it didn't take long for him to face consequences. After a series of private meetings with the Judicial Oversight Committee, Judge Mitchell announced his resignation. The statement was brief, and to many, it felt like an admission of guilt. He cited personal reasons for stepping down, but those who had followed the case knew the real reason. The systemic bias that Marcus had uncovered could no longer be ignored. Months later, the effects of Marcus's efforts were visible. The courthouse in Atlanta had undergone significant reforms. New training programs were introduced for judges and court staff, focusing on recognizing and eliminating bias in the courtroom. The city implemented new policies for handling cases of racial disparity, and accountability measures were put in place to ensure that similar issues wouldn't arise again. Marcus, now a leading voice in the movement for judicial reform, found himself speaking at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences. He shared his experience, his struggle, and his belief that the law should serve everyone equally. One afternoon, after delivering a speech at a law school in downtown Atlanta, Marcus was approached by a young law student. She looked up at him with admiration and determination in her eyes. "You've inspired me," she said, her voice steady. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules. It's about people, and it's about fairness."
Marcus smiled, humbled by her words. The law is meant to serve everyone, but it's up to us to make sure it does. Months passed, and the case that had started as a simple property tax dispute had become something far greater. The changes Marcus had helped implement were far-reaching, affecting courts and legal systems across the country. His work had sparked a national conversation about fairness, accountability, and the need for systemic reform. Though the road had been long, Marcus knew that it wasn't over. The battle for equal justice was just beginning, and he would continue to fight for it, one case, one court, and one step at a time. As the months passed, Marcus found himself thrust into a new role that he had never anticipated, one of leadership in the fight for justice reform. His name had become synonymous with the push for systemic change in the legal system. The publicity surrounding his investigation into Judge Mitchell's actions had raised a much larger conversation about the flaws in the judicial system, and Marcus had become the face of that movement. But with the recognition came more challenges. In the weeks after Judge Mitchell's resignation, Marcus spent much of his time working with the newly formed reform task forces, assisting in drafting new guidelines for courtroom conduct, and working with local activists to develop programs aimed at empowering marginalized communities. He had been invited to serve on several panels and committees discussing racial disparities in the justice system, and though it was rewarding work, it was far from easy. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Marcus sat in his office, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk as he looked over the next set of reports on the court's progress. Despite all the changes that had been made, there were still people resistant to the reforms. There were still whispers in the halls of the courthouse. There were still judges who clung to the old ways. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Grace. "I've got some new data for you. I think you'll want to see this." Marcus raised an eyebrow, picking up his phone to read the full message. It was a link to an anonymous report detailing how, even after the resignation of Judge Mitchell, the courthouse was still struggling with racial disparities. The report mentioned several other judges who had been accused of similar behaviors, although none had yet been as publicized as Mitchell. He leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot. Within an hour, he had arranged a meeting with Grace. When she arrived, she handed him a folder with several pages of research and data. The evidence was troubling. More names, more incidents of unequal treatment. But what struck Marcus the most were the testimonies from defendants who had come forward, telling stories of bias they had experienced in courtrooms across the state. "These stories are consistent with what we've seen," Grace said. "The patterns haven't changed. Mitchell wasn't the only one, and it seems like it's been going on for decades."
Marcus nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him again. He had started this fight with the goal of confronting the systemic bias he had witnessed firsthand. But now, with this new information, he knew it wasn't just about one courtroom or one judge. This was a statewide issue. It was a problem that stretched across the legal system, one that could take years, if not decades, to address. "We can't let this slide," Marcus said, determination creeping back into his voice. "This isn't just a matter of reform anymore. It's about holding people accountable. Every one of these judges needs to be reviewed, and we need to take a stand against this bias." Grace agreed, and they began to strategize on how to take the next steps. They knew that simply gathering evidence wouldn't be enough. This would require mobilizing public support, getting the media involved, and, most importantly, ensuring that the Judicial Review Commission took a long, hard look at the court system as a whole. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus found himself in constant communication with reporters, community leaders, and legal experts, each of them offering a different perspective on how to move forward. But despite the mounting pressure, Marcus never wavered. The case was bigger now than it had ever been. He was no longer just fighting for fairness in his own case. He was fighting for the future of the legal system itself. One afternoon, while attending a town hall meeting to discuss judicial reform, Marcus was approached by a familiar face. It was Richard Foster, the retired bailiff who had shared his own experiences with Marcus months ago. Foster had been hesitant at first, but now he was standing tall, ready to take a more public stance. "I've thought about it a lot," Foster said, his voice low but firm. "I know I kept quiet for too long, but it's time to stand up. You're right, this isn't just about the judges, it's about the whole system. And if we don't do something now, it'll keep going on." Marcus looked at him, appreciating his words. Foster was right. This fight wasn't just about confronting a few bad apples. It was about changing the entire culture of the system. "I need your help, Richard. We can't do this without people like you. People who were there. People who saw it firsthand." Foster nodded. "I'm in. I'll speak out. I'll testify if I need to." The pressure on the Judicial Review Commission grew as more and more individuals came forward with similar accounts of discrimination and bias. The media coverage intensified. Local activists organized rallies, calling for greater transparency in the court system and demanding accountability for those in power. Marcus continued to work tirelessly, preparing reports and meeting with government officials. His days were long, but he knew that this was the fight of his life, the fight that could reshape the future of the justice system for generations to come.
Then, just as things seemed to be gaining momentum, Marcus received an unexpected call from the U.S. Attorney General's office. "Marcus, we've been following your work closely," the voice on the other end of the line said. "What you're doing is groundbreaking, and we want to support you, but we need you to consider something bigger." Marcus listened intently as the Attorney General outlined a proposal, a nationwide investigation into racial disparities in the courts, one that would include Marcus's findings as a primary case study. It was an ambitious plan, but Marcus knew it was the right move. This wasn't just about local reform anymore, it was about national change. "I'm in," Marcus said without hesitation. "Let's do this." Months later, Marcus stood once again in front of a packed courtroom, this time not as a defendant or a prosecutor, but as a key witness in a nationwide inquiry into racial bias in the judicial system. The investigation had sparked a firestorm of conversation across the country, and Marcus was at the center of it. As he took the stand, he knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been, but his conviction was unwavering. He had seen firsthand the way the system treated people differently based on their race, and he was determined to see it change. "I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice," Marcus said, his voice firm as he looked out over the room. But justice isn't just about following the law. It's about fairness, it's about dignity, and it's about making sure that everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has an equal chance in the eyes of the law. The room fell silent. For the first time, people were listening, not just to Marcus, but to the message he was bringing. The fight for justice wasn't over, but it was gaining traction. And with each step forward, the vision of a fairer, more equitable system was becoming a reality. As the inquiry continued and the investigation moved into its next phase, Marcus knew that he had already accomplished something. The system was beginning to change, and he was part of that change. The road ahead would still be difficult, but he was ready for whatever came next. The fight for justice was far from over. But with every voice that spoke out, with every case that was brought to light, it was becoming clearer that real change was within reach. The national investigation into racial disparities in the judicial system gathered momentum quickly. With Marcus at the helm, the scope of the inquiry expanded far beyond what anyone had originally anticipated. His testimony, alongside countless others, had sparked a wave of public outcry. The stories pouring in from across the country, stories of unfair treatment, of disproportionate sentencing, and of biased judicial practices, painted a disturbing picture that could no longer be ignored. As the media continued to cover the unfolding investigation, Marcus found himself increasingly in the public eye. The hashtag #EqualJusticeNow had spread from local communities to nationwide protests, and news outlets began airing stories of those affected by bias in the courtroom. Legal experts,
Activists started to rally around Marcus's cause, and the pressure on the Judicial Review Commission to act became overwhelming. Marcus, however, kept his focus on the long-term goals. It wasn't just about exposing bias, it was about creating real, lasting change. He knew that true reform would require more than just public attention. It would require changes in the law itself, in the structure of the courts, and in the attitudes of those who held power. That meant working with legislators, activists, and the very people who had been wronged by the system. One evening, as Marcus was preparing for yet another round of meetings, Grace called him. "We've got some good news," she said, her voice bright with optimism. "The Judicial Review Commission has decided to move forward with major reforms. They're drafting new guidelines for courtroom behavior, and there's a push for mandatory diversity and bias training for judges and court staff." Marcus sat back in his chair, processing the news. It was a step in the right direction, but he knew the real work was still ahead. The changes needed to be enforced, not just drafted. "That's great news," Marcus replied, "but we can't let them off the hook. This has to be more than just a press release. We need accountability, and we need to ensure that these reforms stick." Grace agreed. "The fight's far from over, but it's progress, Marcus, and it's because of you." Weeks turned into months, and Marcus continued his work with tireless dedication. His days were a blur of meetings, interviews, and court hearings. Despite the long hours and constant pressure, Marcus never faltered. His resolve remained as strong as it had been when he first stepped into that courtroom in Atlanta all those months ago. Through it all, he continued to gather evidence, speak with those affected, and build relationships with others in the legal community. He knew that this was a long game, a battle that would take years to fully change the system, but the tide was shifting. During one particularly long meeting, Marcus found himself in a conference room with several prominent civil rights activists, lawmakers, and legal scholars. The conversation was tense, with each person presenting their vision for reform. There were some who pushed for sweeping legislative changes. Others advocated for more localized actions. But Marcus kept his focus on the big picture. "We can't just address the symptoms," he said, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "We have to get to the root of the problem. This isn't just about bias in one courtroom or in one city. It's systemic. It's about power and about ensuring that power is wielded justly. We need to restructure the way our courts operate so that fairness isn't an afterthought. It's at the very core of what we do." His words resonated with the group, and soon they began to collaborate on a nationwide strategy to address judicial bias. Together, they proposed legislation that would require regular audits of court outcomes, establish independent oversight committees, and mandate that all judges and court staff undergo ongoing diversity and inclusion training. The bill, which would eventually be called the Justice for All Act, gained significant support across the country. It wasn't just from people who had been directly impacted by bias in the courts. It was from everyday citizens who saw the injustice and wanted to see it end. As the months rolled by, Marcus's role in the reform movement only grew. He found himself invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and civil rights conferences. His words inspired a new generation of young lawyers, many of whom saw in him the kind of advocate they aspired to be.
At one such event, a young woman approached him after his speech, her eyes bright with admiration. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about following the rules," she said, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "It's about doing what's right, no matter what the system tells you." Marcus smiled, humbled by her words. The law should be a tool for justice, but it's up to all of us to make sure it serves everyone, equally and without exception. The culmination of the national investigation came with a landmark hearing in Washington, D.C. Representatives from the Judicial Review Commission, along with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and members of the media, gathered in a packed conference room to discuss the findings and the proposed reforms. The hearing was intense, with impassioned speeches from all sides. The evidence that had been gathered was overwhelming. Statistics, testimonies, case studies, and personal stories all pointed to the same conclusion. The judicial system was broken, and it was time to fix it. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he took the podium with the same calm determination that had defined his career. The room fell silent as he addressed the crowd. Today, we are not just talking about legal procedures or courtroom decorum, we are talking about people's lives. The decisions made in courtrooms affect every person who walks through those doors. For too long, we've allowed our system to be influenced by bias and inequality. It's time to change that. It's time for a justice system that serves everyone fairly and without exception. His words were met with applause, and Marcus felt a sense of pride. This wasn't about him. It was about the countless individuals who had been wronged, whose voices had been ignored. It was about ensuring that, from this moment forward, they would be heard. Months later, the Justice for All Act was signed into law. It was a monumental achievement, a victory not just for Marcus, but for every person who had been affected by the systemic biases in the legal system. The bill established an independent oversight committee for the courts, mandated regular audits of judicial outcomes, and required ongoing diversity training for all court staff. It was just the beginning, though. The work was far from over. But Marcus had set the foundation for a new era of justice, one where fairness, dignity, and equality were at the heart of every decision made in the courtroom.
Years passed, and Marcus's influence continued to grow. He became a mentor to a new generation of lawyers, teaching them not just the law, but the importance of standing up for what was right. His name became synonymous with justice, but he remained humble, always focused on the work that still needed to be done. In his office, Marcus kept a small framed photograph on his desk, a picture of the courthouse in Atlanta, the place where it all began. Below the photo, a simple quote read, "The law is not justice. Justice is the law that serves everyone equally." As he looked at the photo, Marcus knew that while the battle for justice was ongoing, the tide had already begun to turn. And with every case, every reform, and every voice raised in support of equality, he knew that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. Years passed, and the reforms introduced by Marcus and his allies began to take root. The Justice for All Act became a model for other states to follow, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. The road to reform was still long, but the change that Marcus had fought for was undeniable. Across the nation, courthouses began to implement the changes required by the new law. Judges and court staff underwent regular diversity and bias training, and independent oversight committees were established in every district. The media, once skeptical of Marcus's efforts, now praised the reforms as a turning point in the fight for justice. But as Marcus's influence grew, so did the opposition. A new breed of conservative legal scholars and judges began to argue that the reforms were too broad, too invasive. They claimed that mandatory bias training violated judicial independence, and that the audits of court decisions were an infringement on the rights of judges to make rulings based on their expertise. Marcus had anticipated this resistance. For every action that brought about change, there would be pushback.
But he was no stranger to adversity. He had faced down biased judges, powerful adversaries, and an entrenched system that was determined to maintain the status quo. And he knew that the battle was far from over. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his office reviewing reports on the implementation of the new reforms, Grace walked in, holding a stack of documents. She had a concerned look on her face. "Marcus, I think we need to talk about this," Grace said, laying the stack of papers on his desk. Marcus looked up from his work. "What's going on?" "These are reports from some of the judges who are pushing back against the reforms," Grace explained. "They're claiming that the audits and the diversity training are compromising their ability to be impartial. They argue that it's making them less effective in the courtroom." Marcus frowned, rubbing his forehead. He had expected this, but it still stung. They don't get it, do they? This isn't about questioning their expertise. This is about making sure they recognize their biases and treat everyone equally.
Grace nodded. They're framing it as a political attack. They're saying that the reforms are part of a larger movement to undermine the judicial system. Some are even talking about lawsuits to challenge the law itself. Marcus took a deep breath. This was the kind of opposition he had feared, the kind that would attempt to turn public opinion against the reforms by painting them as unnecessary or even dangerous. He could already feel the pressure mounting. "We can't let them get away with this," Marcus said, his voice low and determined. "We've come too far to back down now. We need to counter this argument head on. It's not just about fairness, it's about the integrity of the system. The reforms aren't just a response to past injustice, they're a way to build a better future." Grace nodded again. "I agree, but we'll need a strong public campaign to get ahead of this. We need to remind people why these reforms matter, why they're essential, and we need to show that the reforms are working." In the weeks that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly to strengthen the momentum behind the reforms. He enlisted the help of civil rights groups, legal experts, and community leaders to launch a public campaign that highlighted the positive impact of the Justice for All Act. They collected testimonies from people whose lives had been affected by biased court decisions, showing how the reforms had helped level the playing field. The media, which had once been critical of Marcus's actions, now found itself covering the successes of the reforms in a more positive light. Stories about judges who had implemented the training and had seen measurable improvements in their courts began to emerge. Local news stations aired interviews with defendants who had been treated more fairly, and legal experts weighed in on how the reforms had made the courts more transparent and accountable. But the opposition wasn't done. Conservative think tanks and powerful legal organizations continued to push back, using their influence to sway public opinion. They argued that the reforms were too far-reaching, that they were a government overreach into the independence of the judiciary. In response, Marcus gave a speech at a national conference on justice reform, one that would go down in history as one of his defining moments. As he stood before a packed auditorium of lawyers, judges, activists, and lawmakers, he spoke with the same passion and clarity that had defined his entire career. "The reforms we've introduced are not an attack on the judiciary," he began, his voice ringing out across the room. "They are a way to ensure that our courts are truly serving justice. Justice is not a privilege for the few. It is a right for everyone. And it is not enough for us to simply claim that we uphold justice. We must prove it day in and day out with every decision we make and with every person who walks through our doors." The audience sat in rapt attention as Marcus continued, his words more powerful than ever. "We know that the system has flaws. We know that bias exists, whether we like to admit it or not. But the question we must ask ourselves is this: do we have the courage to fix it? Do we have the courage to challenge the system that has served some well and others not at all?"
He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. These reforms are not just necessary, they are long overdue. The law must serve all of us, Not just those with power, not just those with privilege, but everyone. The speech was widely covered in the media, and soon after, the tide of public opinion began to shift. The campaign to defend the reforms gained new momentum. More and more people came forward to support the changes, rallying behind Marcus's message of fairness and equality. As the political pressure mounted, the opposition found itself on the defensive. Despite their efforts to undermine the reforms, they could no longer ignore the overwhelming public support for Marcus's cause. Slowly but surely, the resistance began to crumble. More judges agreed to voluntarily implement the reforms, and more courts began to see the positive effects of increased accountability and training. Years later, Marcus stood once again in front of a group of young law students, sharing his story and his lessons learned over the course of a lifetime of fighting for justice. Change doesn't happen overnight, he told them, and it doesn't come without a fight. But if you stand firm, if you refuse to back down when you know something is wrong, change will come. And when it does, it will be because of people like you. People who see injustice and refuse to accept it. The students were hanging on every word. Marcus could see it in their eyes. He had given them something they could hold on to as they began their own journeys in the law. They were the future, and the future of justice was bright. In the years following the passage of the Justice for All Act, the impact of the reforms Marcus had championed was far-reaching. Courtrooms across the country became more transparent, more accountable, and more committed to ensuring fairness for all. The judicial system, once entrenched in bias and inequality, had begun the long road to healing. Marcus's work was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, still reforms to be made. But as he stood before the next generation of legal minds, he knew that the fight he had started was one that would continue for years to come, and he was proud to have been a part of it. The story of Marcus Hayes highlights the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the face of resistance. One of the key messages is that change requires persistence and courage, especially when confronting systemic issues like bias and injustice. Marcus's journey teaches us that true leadership is not just about winning battles, but about challenging entrenched systems and advocating for fairness and equality. His commitment to justice shows that standing up for others, even when it's difficult, can spark real, lasting change. Another lesson is the power of accountability. Marcus's work demonstrates that we must not only recognize the problems, but actively seek solutions and hold those in power accountable for their actions. This story encourages us to examine our own biases and be willing to evolve, showing that change begins with us, our actions, our willingness to speak up, and our dedication to fairness. In life, whether in the workplace, our communities, or within ourselves, we should strive to act with integrity, challenge injustices, and work toward creating a more equitable world for all. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.